Greetings. Today, with our help, you are going to master Section 1, Part A of the Seminar End of Course exam. Okay, so let's hop right into it. So Slide 1 corresponds to Question 1, which primarily deals with the main argument and the thesis of the paper you are trying to analyze. In order to receive maximum points of this section, you must first identify the author's thesis, then understand the argument of the paper. First, the thesis of the paper is usually easy to spot because it is an initial setup for the paper by giving the author's opinion, the paper's main idea, and setups the point the author will make in the paper. Theses and main ideas are usually presented at the beginning of the paper or near the beginning, in a spot where the reader can easily acknowledge it and understand the rest of the paper. In these papers, simply restate the thesis of the paper and identify the article's main idea through the thesis. An example of a thesis could be, as a lingua franca, English has played a pivotal role in the development of globalization through political, economic, and social connections. In this thesis, the main idea would be English's role in the development of globalization. Almost all, if not all, papers and articles have their main idea in thesis, and most have their theses in the first paragraph. Occasionally, the thesis would be in the second or third or last paragraph. Even these theses should be easily spotted as the subject, main idea, or reasoning of the body paragraphs and sections of a paper are all present in the thesis. So just look for keywords and it shouldn't be hard at all. The second part of this question is understanding the argument of the paper. The best and the quickest place to look for the main argument and position of the paper is through the thesis. In every paper that takes a position on one side of an argument, the thesis lays out the plan for presenting the argument throughout the paper. Simply read the thesis and determine which side of the main idea the paper falls under. In the example used previously, the main idea was English's role in development of globalization. From the thesis, we can gather that this paper's argument leans toward that of English has played a large role in the development of globalization. In order to get the maximum amount of points, make sure you don't restate an argument that is too vague or an argument that is too specific. For example, saying the argument is English has played a large role is too vague because it does not establish the frame of the paper is covering. This argument could include English's role in ancient writings or the development of English in the distant future. On the flip side, saying the paper's argument as English has played a large role in the development of globalization in the political sense for the past 20 years is way too specific because the paper covers more information and events than that. All in all, the argument can be easily identified by the main idea, which in turn can easily be identified through the thesis of the paper. Now on to Slide 2. Question 2 deals with the response establishing the author's claim, the connections between them, and more importantly, the author's line of reasoning. This section is mainly logical and you can't fully rely on just finding items in the paper. After identifying the main idea and the author's argument, you must look at his individual argument and reasons. The topics of each body paragraph and section sometimes are organized chronologically, sometimes by lens, sometimes by importance and relevance to the argument. To gain maximum points on this section, you must look at these individual arguments, see how they tie into the main idea, and more importantly, tie into each other. Identifying relevant claims that successfully link the argument of the paper will produce appropriate connection. Question 3 of the rubric questions and evaluates if the evidence supports the argument and the credibility of the evidence. This section is to make you think if the author's sources support his arguments and are related to the question. According to the rubric, the response provides a thorough and detailed evaluation of how well the evidence supports the argument. The response evaluates the relevance and credibility of the evidence. When you're writing this part of the section, you need to make a detailed evaluation of the evidence in the paper and link the evidence to the argument. The linking of the evidence serves as commentary. A good way to evaluate how well the evidence supports the argument is if the evidence directly supports the author's claim. Another way is there isn't any evidence that does help or support the argument. A way to do the second part of question 3 is seeing how closely related the topic of the paper is to the author's topic. And finally, looking at the credibility of the sources. You can do this by looking at the author of the evidence, evaluating their credentials, and looking at if the author has the proper knowledge to talk about the subject. Let's take an article to analyze this practice. The example we'll be using is The Rise of Esports by Bryce C. Blum and Stephen D. Fisher. In the first paragraph, some extra fluff is added before a set of questions are presented. The questions then tie back to the first sentence, cementing the first sentence as the thesis for the paper. Riot Games has made no secrets of intention to build its game into a competitive sport and thereby vault electronic sports, or esports into mainstream culture. Blum, Fisher. For this thesis, we can gather the main idea of the article, League of Legends, elevation into mainstream. The paper's main argument in support of League of Legends becoming a true competitive sport, and the author's reasons, which are in turn the main ideas of the individual sections of the paper. From there, we read on to identify the connections made throughout the paper, such as the status of professional players, the spectator sport, and the large audience it draws in. The reasons are then proved in the body paragraphs by acknowledging similar games already elevated at that level, such as StarCraft II, and the enormous prize pools at scene competitions. This is a good example of a harder to understand paper because it doesn't follow the usual rules set for theses and evidence throughout the paper, choosing to instead present the argument through different perspectives. However, the thesis, main idea, connections, and evidence are still easy to identify.